Hi, I'm Alan Mauldin with TeleGeography, and today I'm going to be giving you a presentation called Scale, the Quest for Universal Submarine Cable Market Laws. I was inspired to do a presentation with this title from a book I've been reading. It has an interesting title. It's called Scale. This book came out in 2017, and it focuses on different scaling laws and how they shape biology, cities, corporations. The cover caught my eye. As you can see, if you zoom in, it shows submarine cables on the map. That's right. So what are some scaling laws? Well, so the growth of systems, often eventually it slows down due to physical, economic, or social constraints. And one of those is Kleiber's law here, which I've charted here, and it shows that when you have a 4x increase in the mass of animals on the bottom x-axis, what you have is a 3x decrease in the heart rate of the animals. That's sublinear growth. So you can see here from a mouse going down to an elephant, there's kind of a pattern emerging there. Now, other systems experience an output where it's growing faster than the size. So this is superlinear growth. So here's Metcalfe's law. This is showing the number of users in the bottom x-axis, and the growth in the y is the number of connections possible between those users. So it's growing at a faster rate. So these are some scaling laws. We have seen many scaling laws that are applied and have been applied in the past to the telecom industry. So one example would be more of a physical law, Shannon's limit, which I think many people are aware of in the submarine cable industry. This is about the channel capacity of a network and how it scales in relationship with the bandwidth and the signal to noise ratio of the network. There's more things like that are more empirical laws. These are things like Gilder's law, which was popularized in the late 90s in telecom boom days. That stated that the total bandwidth of communication systems would triple every year, 200% CAGR. Not really true anymore. One other law was Nielsen's law, which states that broadband connection speed for end users doubles every 21 months, which was a 50% CAGR. And finally, the famous one, Moore's law, which really applies to the semiconductor industry, but it was also applied to this industry to talk about bandwidth demand growth. And this law states that the amount of bandwidth is doubling every 2 years, which equates to a 41% compound annual growth rate. So what I want to do here is see if there's any scaling laws that apply to the submarine cable industry. So I want to look at three different things. First is we're going to look at scaling demand growth versus time. Then we're going to look at scaling the number of cables in aggregate on a route versus demand. Looking at scaling bandwidth prices versus demand. So let's get started with the first one, which is demand growth versus time. So this is basically going to look at the Moore's law, scaling law, and is that still really true? So the Moore's law's threshold is 41%. I put that here on this chart showing compound annual growth rates. I have various submarine cable routes across the bottom, and we're going to look at some different periods here from 2010 up to 2024. In the first period, you can see here, we were really at or above the Moore's law's threshold for all these routes from 2010 to 2015. Next period, most of the routes were still, at or above that level for 2015 to 2020. Now, here's where it's changed a bit in the most recent period, 2020 to 2024. You can see most of these routes, the Atlantic, Pacific, intra-Asia, Europe to Asia, have fallen well below Moore's law threshold. One exception here, Africa to Europe, is just at that level. So is there a new scaling law that is not Moore's law? Well, we can definitely state that bandwidth growth scales at an exponential rate still, exponential rate with time, but it is really falling below the Moore's law threshold there. What we see happening in our research is our forecasts show that growth is somewhere between 25 to 35% on an annual basis, but it really varies a lot by region. You can see here a chart showing how it varies for some of the major submarine cable routes. So why does this matter? Well, I think the impact here is that things have become so big in this industry that even when we have slowing demand growth, 25% growth of a massive amount is still a huge amount of capacity being added to networks. So we shouldn't fret too much that there's not going to be enough demand for bandwidth going forward. The next area is the number of cables per route in aggregate versus bandwidth on a route. So for that, we're going to start by looking at scaling cables versus the bandwidth in the transatlantic. So this chart here has two axis lines. You can see used bandwidth on the left, number of cables on the right here. And the bandwidth has been going up and up and up and up since 2005 here. At the same time, pretty interesting, the number of cables in aggregate on the route, it fluctuates a little bit, but it hasn't changed that much. So that's really due to the ability of cables after they've entered service. There's been the ability to, with improvements to the SLTE, to improve the capacity of the cables. So we didn't need to have a lot of new cables to scale the bandwidth on the routes. This is starting to change a bit. You can see here, we're seeing it going up a bit, but the announced new cables in the Atlantic with the bandwidth growth, both of them are going up and to the right here. In the North Pacific, similar thing, very constant number of cables. Some cables retired, some added, right, but been going up. And with the announced cables in the Pacific versus the demand, you can see an even stronger upward line here. So let's look at some math and see what's happening here mathematically. So we have a very weak correlation between bandwidth and number of cables in the Atlantic from 2005 to 2019. A correlation, of 1 is perfect correlation. If it's this low, like a 0.39, that's a very, very poor correlation. But in recent years, hey, it's pretty good, 0.84, getting a bit stronger there in terms of how we see the number of cables scaling as the bandwidth is growing. In the Northern Trans-Pacific, it's pretty similar. It was weaker in the past. It's becoming much, much stronger now. So can we just use math to figure out the number of new cables we're going to have on a route in the future? Well, not exactly. And here's why. Many factors do influence the cable count. So one of them clearly is technological. So as I mentioned, we're kind of nearing the limits with the capacity per fiber pair. That means to see improvements in the capacity, that's only possible with higher fiber count and in the future number of cores per fiber. That's only possible with new cables, right? So you can see here in the Atlantic how we're seeing more fiber pairs in cables than we did in the past. One other key factor here is what I would call more of a commercial factor, and the focus on what I would call building networks, not just cables. And Google is a good example of this. They're building a global network based upon 16 fiber pair cables. They aren't seeking to try to optimize and push the capacity of each subsequent cable they build, right? They're going to build a network of 16. How long that meets their demand requirements, we'll see. But they may need to rebuild and overbuild this in a sooner period of time than they would have normally, where they'd have tried to, let's say, boost each cable as they went along. There clearly are advantages to standardizing by using the same pair count when building a network, not just trying to optimize always. But the other angle here is there going to be enough wholesale capacity on content provider cables to serve the market? Most of the cables and major routes are being built by Google and Meta. And so if there's not enough available on those cables, that could lead to the other operators who need capacity having to build cables themselves to meet demand. We do see non-content provider cables being built as well, right? That definitely happens, but these aren't really that large. They tend to be more, what I would say, right-sized for their own requirements. So the E to A cable planned for 2028, I believe, is only 12 fiber pairs. Manta in South America, the Caribbean, only 10 pairs. So you aren't seeing higher capacity cables, which would perhaps forego the need to add cables as soon as otherwise would be required. Other factors here, geopolitical. We're seeing the need to build cables that avoid certain regions, South China Sea, Red Sea, obvious examples here. Also, there are some issues here which I guess relate to geopolitics, also commercial factors, as well as, not all operators are willing to invest alongside each other on new cables. So that could lead to maybe more cables built than you would otherwise need to have, possibly. Also, there's a scenario where, not all operators will use cables, will buy capacity or invest in cables that are built by certain cable suppliers. So that can lead to maybe more cables than you might otherwise need on some of these routes. So the question here we're trying to explore is there a scaling law emerging here? Well, the number of cables on a route, it definitely scales at a slower rate than total bandwidth. So if we're going to have a doubling of the route-wide bandwidth, we do not need to have 2 times the number of cables in aggregate. It's less than that. So it's a sublinear rate here. But because of the caveats I mentioned, the technological, commercial, and the geopolitical factors, I think it's really hard to create a scaling law, to create a formula that was going to show the exact number of cables we're going to see in the future. The other key angle here, which I just mentioning now, is the retirement angle. And many cables are old, will be retired in the future, and that could lead to some net reductions in total cable count in some years in the future. So why does any of this matter? I think one key thing is, if we do end up seeing more cables per route than ever before, that's going to have implications for the maintenance market, also for route planning, and also for cable stations. Okay, now for the last section, prices versus demand. So this chart is showing the differences in price and demand for the Trans-Pacific route between 2018 and 2024. I'm using a LA-Tokyo price here for 100 gig wave. That's the turquoise line. The darker blue is the used bandwidth. So no surprise here. Demand is going up, price is going down. So what does that mean in terms of a correlation? Well, there is a pretty strong correlation here, a 0.9 R squared for this route. So what's happening here? Why is this going on? Well, as you recall from my first slide, talking about how larger animals are more energy efficient per unit of mass. So similarly, as cables have scaled, there's also different ways things become more efficient. And one of those ways is get more capacity for a lower unit cost. So I have some examples here over time of 3 generations of CME cables. You can see the reduction here in the lower unit costs. And what tends to happen is the lower unit costs are passed along to customers in the form of lower unit prices. Of course, that requires the market to be competitive for that to happen. Now, demand is not really price elastic. What that means is that if you lower prices, that does not spur demand growth. So this only goes in one direction. We're seeing the lower capacity driven by higher demand. That does tend to lead to the lower prices, not the other way around. So if you're upset that I've only showed examples so far in the Atlantic and the Pacific, I have some slides for you. So for this, I'm going to look at several different other routes to show how this relationship can vary. So again, this is 2018, 2014. Each of these is going to be the same year range. First one I have here, US to Latin America. The route I'm viewing for price is Miami to Sao Paulo. Very strong R squared here, you can see 0.996. Let's look at Europe to India. This is using a Marseille-Mumbai 100G price. The correlation here, not quite as strong, only a 0.67. Erosion has been a bit slower in India for prices than in other routes. Next, we have Europe to South Africa. The price here is a London to Johannesburg price. Pretty strong price erosion here, solid demand growth as well. and it's a very strong R squared of 0.994. The last one I want to show here, Australia, United States. This is a LA Sydney price. The price erosion here has not been that rapid compared to the demand growth. Thus, the R squared is not quite as strong as other routes. It's 0.66. But the question is, is there a scaling law emerging here? So we can definitely state that wholesale prices, they scale downward exponentially as demand increases. That's been the case for a long time. But this will only continue, though, as long as we continue to have unit cost declines, enough supply in the market, right? We have to have that available to us to sell, to have something to offer a price for, and the market needs to be competitive as well. So why does this matter? What is the impact of this scaling law? Well, going back to the first scaling law I looked at, we saw that the demand growth has been slowing, right? So what that means is that as demand growth is slowing, we are seeing also a slowing rate of price erosion. So we don't really see 25% and greater annual drops in wavelength prices anymore. The erosion has slowed, and it tends to be 10 to 15%. Depends on the route in the year, but there definitely is a slowing of price erosion. Now, finally, I think it's important to mention two letters in every presentation. Those letters are A and I. And so I will close with a few thoughts on AI and if it's a new scaling challenge. So it's really challenging to understand just how AI is going to impact the submarine cable industry. Recently, Meta gave a great presentation, I thought, in August at their At Scale conference, which offers perhaps a bit of a hint in what's coming up in the future for the scale of the demand requirements driven by AI. So what they did was they had this comparison showing their Express backbone network, which is their interdata center network linking sites within North America, across the Atlantic, and to Europe. They compared that, the capacity of that entire network, to one site pair for their planned AI backbone. Again, so just the capacity between two locations, that will have 2x the scale of their whole EBB, according to what Meta released. Now, there's no detail or extra info offered on how this would play out for their entire network, the international segments that are more submarine specific. So we can't really have a view on that, but this does provide some indication of type of scale be considered. But when it comes to scale, AI has many scaling challenges of its own, with how to scale the number of chips and power and transmission and data centers and all these things that are needed for AI to work. This chart I have here is from the International Energy Agency showing the forecast for power consumption by data centers by region. You can see basically looking at I think it's a 2x increase from 2025 to 2030. So a lot of scaling needs to take place for data centers as well. Now, one thing that I'm asked about a lot, and many people, maybe you have been asked this as well, there is not, as far as I can see, any type of a scaling law that governs how data center size and power translates into inter-data center bandwidth requirements. Every data center is going to be different in the workloads that are being performed in those facilities, how the network is designed and architected, who the users are, where are these data centers. So always have a bearing on the demand requirement. So we can't simply say 100 megawatt facility equals 100 terabit of capacity over whatever. That type of a scaling law does not exist that I'm aware of. To conclude here, I want to offer one cautionary tale of scale. This was featured in the book Scale I mentioned at the outset. That was the inspiration for this presentation. In the book, they talk about this ship, which is the Great Eastern. This was 5 times larger than the largest existing vessel at the time. They just took whatever the largest one was and scaled everything 5x. They didn't really understand drag and hull shape and different things that would influence this vessel. As a result, it was a failure. It was really expensive, it was slow, and it was an inefficient ship to operate. Now, for all you submarine cable nerds out there, this is pretty interesting, because after this ship left the passenger market, because it was so big and it was so stable, it was the ideal ship for laying cables, actually. And so it ended up being the ship that laid the first transatlantic cable in the 1860s. I thought that was pretty neat. Anyhow, that's all I have for this presentation. Thank you for listening.